Let's focus on just rudimentary parts of our brain so that we can understand how learning occurs, how perception occurs, and how, once you understand some of the basic facts of the brain, you can use that to help you learn. And so learning is a very difficult concept to nail down. There are many different ways a person can learn, through auditory stimulus, visual stimulus. So depending on what your strengths are, we learn in different ways. However, learning is not a linear process. It is not as straightforward as me telling you something or showing you something or a teacher showing you something and suddenly you are able to assimilate it. It might take a long time. It might take repetitions. Persistence is probably very, very important in learning. So learning can be enhanced by certain factors, but it can also be inhibited by certain factors. For example, stress, anxiety, and fear can actually hinder the learning process, and we'll see why that is in just a few moments. So let's try to understand some basic parts of the brain. This may look very complicated, but we're only going to focus on certain parts. And this way, if you understand where those parts are in your own head, it might give you a little bit of awareness of where the brain parts are that we're going to focus on. So in doing mathematics, we need problem-solving skills and being able to concentrate, being able to think. And those parts are located in your frontal lobe, which is right here behind your forehead. So this is one of the important parts for math learning. That's called the frontal cortex. Speech, because you have to be able to understand what the teacher is saying, what other people are saying, because if you understand speech, right, you basically can hear it, and then you can speak yourself. That actually enhances learning. Memory, we know that once you learn something, unless your brain is able to store it in long-term memory or even short-term memory, learning cannot take place. So this is where, right here is where the memory center is in your brain. And then, of course, breathing. We all need to breathe, which is an autonomous system. However, you can also consciously think of breath, which has shown to reduce stress, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So breathing and body awareness and attention is part of something called mindfulness practice, which allows you to enhance your brain and lower your stress, inhibit some of the hormones that we're going to talk about, which will make you a little more focused on problem solving and allow your memory to work properly. Vision and perception, you have to be able to see and understand what the symbols represent. And so our brain has to see stimulus in order to learn. Language and comprehension is also very important in order for learning, because mathematics is a language and you have to be able to understand what the symbols and the context in which those symbols appear and what they mean. So language is another important area for you in order to be able to learn properly. So decoding learning has many factors. There's a lot of research out there. We're only going to talk about some basic facts. Learning is based on our perceptions of visual and auditory stimuli, like we talked about. Creation of all new perception begin with a question or a step into uncertainty. And some of us are more comfortable stepping into uncertainty, and others of us are very, very comfortable just being in comfortable situation where we're always certain of what our surroundings and environment are like. And so learning for some people can become very uncomfortable because you're always starting with a question and stepping into uncertainty. However, you can train yourself to become open and not be afraid of uncertainty. Our brains are constantly trying to understand our environment and protect us from harm. And so we're constantly redefining what normal means, and it's based on our ecology, our surroundings, our environment, and our mental states, and also the meaning of definitions. So for example, if you found out that I'm a math teacher, automatically you will say, oh, you're really smart. And that's because of how you give the definition meaning for being a mathematician. So we are in habit to quickly make judgments and put labels and box certain people, certain stimulus into these particular definitions. But if we keep an open mind and not have prejudgment, that allows us to become good learners. So learning occurs by mirroring what we see, and the research on mirror neurons is very, very fascinating. There's a lot of TED Talks on brain research, and one of them is on mirror neurons, which you might want to look into. Anyway, so a mirror neuron is activated when an animal acts and observes the same action performed by another. For example, if you saw somebody pricking my left hand with a pin, you might feel the same pain that I feel, except you might not say ouch because you're not really getting poked. But the research shows that the same part of your brain is activated as my brain. And the same thing occurs when we are learning anything. And so learning is very, very interesting concept because mirror neurons is what are used to learn. It's a learned behavior to be able to be scared of mathematics. It's a learned behavior also to overcome that fear of learning. Anyway, so first, mirror neurons were observed in 1992, and now neurologists think it is a very important piece in understanding intention as well as action. Remember, in order to learn, there has to be an intention, and there has to be a willingness of action to be persistent. Even if you fail at the beginning, you have to just keep going at it. A lot of this research is done by Dr. Lotto and Ramachandran. You might want to look into that if you're interested in this. So neural actions are involuntary and automatic. All right, so in order to learn, you have to be able to perceive things. So let's investigate what that really means. When light bounces off a stimulus like this one here, it goes in less than a first few tenths of a second to your occipital lobe or visual cortex, and then that visual cortex will send a representation of this image in two different directions for processing. And so the two places where it will go is the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. Hippocampus is where long-term memories are stored, and the prefrontal cortex and other parts of the brain are used for more sophisticated analysis. And the reason for this is it is perceiving if there's a threat. Because if there's a threat, then you have to be able to respond appropriately. So in order to perceive, we have to be able to eliminate fear. Because if the fear is there, then immediately your brain will take actions and there is no hope of learning. So light bounces off, you see an image, and it's sent to these two places for processing. Once the brain processes a threat, then the signal will go to the amygdala, and the flight or fight neural system is activated. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex is pulling information from long-term memory to access. Now, if you're under stress, there are many chemicals released by your brain. So there are some primary neurotransmitters. Those are the chemicals. You don't have to worry too much about these names, but sometimes people are interested, and so that's why I have the names of these neurotransmitters if you want to look at them. And so some of the important neurotransmitters that you should be concerned about is the cortisol, which is a stress hormone released by the adrenal glands, which stimulates the amygdala. Amygdala is the part of the brain that processes fear. And once this cortisol is released in your bloodstream, it will inhibit the hippocampus. So you no longer have access to your long-term memory, which explains why a lot of students will say, on an exam, oh, I learned everything, and on an exam I couldn't remember anything. And that's because you have cortisol in your bloodstream that the brain has released because of stress hormone, and now it is inhibiting long-term memory because now your brain is in a mode of flight or fight response. So that is why it's very important to be able to reduce stress so that you can learn and function properly on exams, to show people what you have learned in assessments. Serotonin regulates mood, sleep, and digestion, and dopamine levels are important because they are involved with reward and attention, and they promote approach behaviors. Dopamine is released when you perceive reward. So if you solve a problem and you get it, dopamine is going to be released because you feel like, I got it, and that's the reward system being activated in your brain. But if the reward is less than expected, then the dopamine levels drop and you have the unpleasant feelings and you want that to change. And that's where the logic part will be activated and you'll be like, it's not worth your time. And so it's very important to overcome this stage of not giving up, even if you are uncomfortable. The hypothalamus regulates the endocrine system and the autonomic nervous system. And lack of food depletes energy needed to produce hormones regulating brain. That's why it's so important to exercise properly and eat good nutritious food for your brain, like nuts and vegetables and fruit, so that you can have the appropriate energy required by your brain. Because your brain, although it's only 2% of the body weight, uses 20% of oxygen. That's a lot of energy being used by such a small part of your body. So anyway, when you have neuromodulators, like including endorphins released in your body, they strengthen neural circuits. And so fire together, wire together, you probably heard. So every time you solve a problem, if you feel rewarded, it will solidify that connection. And every time you do that kind of activity, you'll have same kind of reaction in your body. So when you succeed at a problem after several tries, that pleasure set of chemicals will allow you to cement the synaptic connections, allowing you to be able to do that behavior again and again. So rewards need to be substantial, otherwise our brain thinks it's not worth our effort. So problem solving automatically triggers past experiences. We're automatically primed to do that. And rapid fire instructions, when they send us into a chronic stress state, it makes our brain release adrenaline, cortisol, and it decreases our short-term memory. And chronic stress can actually affect long-term memory and start affecting learning then. That is one of the reasons why it's so important to reduce our stress, because the chemicals will affect our hippocampus where long-term memories are stored. In fact, we're more likely to store negative memories than positive ones, just because evolutionary, if we keep track of negative experiences, it will protect us in the future from harm. And so positive memories are like balloons. They come in, they float, and they leave us. And so positive experience just don't quite stick like negative experiences. It takes about 50 positive experiences to overcome one negative experience. That's the power of negative experiences. So even though the negative experiences are gone, they don't completely ever leave. They leave a trace and they are ready to be activated in the future if the brain feels it needs it. So it's very interesting how negative memories affect us. In fact, the anterior cingulate cortex, that's right there, and the amygdala are responsible for being able to work abstract problems, and also they're primary overseers of our attention. Remember, amygdala is the part of the brain that fires anytime you're stressed out because you're ready to fight. So now that you understand a little bit about the basic functions of the brain, we need to see how we can strengthen that, and that's where mindfulness practice comes in. Mindfulness simply means observing ourselves without judgment, and one way to do that is to focus in on our in and out breath. We will give you some practices that will allow you to use mindfulness practices when you are actually stressed. It is important to practice regularly so that when you're in a stressful situation, you have access to this kind of practice and it will come automatically to you. So in the next few series, we'll give you 3 to 4 mindfulness practices that you can practice on your own.